They said the mountains would keep travelers safe. They lied. The road to Millbrook Inn is not a road at all. It is a test, a narrow cut through black pine and limestone, where every tree leans in close as if listening. Men swear they hear whispers there, not of wind but of something older, something patient. At the end of that road stood 4 sisters. Their smiles were lanterns in a world without light, their voices soft as velvet over a coffin lid. And 43 men who passed through those doors never came out again. Margaret the eldest, with eyes that measured everything like a merchant weighing gold. Catherine the beauty, whose every glance promised warmth but carried the chill of the grave. Sarah the healer, whose hands knew every root, every berry, every poison. Elizabeth the youngest, with laughter bright enough to burn away suspicion itself. The inn glowed at night like a watchful spirit, its windows calling to lonely travelers, step inside and rest, step inside and be known, step inside and disappear, because the sisters had learned what most men never do. They learned how to weigh a soul before it speaks. They learned which men would not be missed, and they learned how to erase them so cleanly that not even memory could hold on. This is not just a tale of murder. This is a map of power, a lesson in how charm becomes a weapon, how hospitality becomes a trap, and how even the softest hands can close around your throat. You think you know evil, but you have never looked it in the eye while it poured your wine and offered you comfort by the fire. Listen closely. What I am about to tell you is knowledge that cannot be forgotten. Once you hear it, you will never walk alone at night without wondering who is watching. You will never take a stranger's kindness without asking what it costs. The ground behind Millbrook holds its secrets, but the earth remembers. It always remembers. The first kill was not planned. It never is. A storm came down the valley like a curse. A lone traveller staggered through the door, soaked to the bone with gold in his pockets and fear in his eyes. He was looking for warmth. But what he found was judgment. Margaret saw it first, the way his gaze lingered too long on Catherine, the way his voice slurred when the bottle emptied too fast, the way he bragged about his winnings and the men he'd cheated to earn them. "A man like that will not be missed," she whispered. Sarah's hands trembled as she crushed the herbs. Catherine kept him laughing. Elizabeth watched from the stairs, eyes wide, with something that was not fear and not mercy. When the poison slid into his cup, it felt like an accident wearing a borrowed face. He never saw the shadow cross the room. He never felt the cold bite of the night air when they dragged him outside. By dawn, the ground behind the inn was heavier by one shallow grave, and the sisters were heavier by a secret. But secrets do not stay buried. They grow roots. They call for water. The second man came a week later, the third the week after. Each time the choice was easier. Each time the planning sharper. Margaret kept a ledger, not of names but of traits. Catherine refined her smile until no man could refuse. Sarah perfected her doses. Elizabeth learned how to read a heartbeat through the floorboards. Soon the killings were no longer storms. They were seasons, regular, predictable, controlled. Travelers vanished, but no one questioned. The mountains were wide, the winters were cruel. Men disappear in such places, and the world moves on. The sisters learned that murder is not chaos. It is craft. It is patience. It is knowing when to strike and how to clean the blade before anyone sees the blood. This is how darkness begins, not with rage, not with madness, but with a single decision to make the world lighter by removing someone no one will miss. And once that door opens, it never closes. Death became a guest at Millbrook Inn, not loud, not clumsy, but welcomed and seated at the head of the table. Margaret built the plan piece by piece. She studied the road. She learned when caravans passed and when men rode alone. She watched which faces were trusted in nearby towns and which were already shadowed by suspicion. She chose carefully. Catherine perfected her performance. A glance to lure, a laugh to soften, a sigh to promise more than she ever intended to give. Men followed her gaze like moths chasing lantern light, and like moths they burned without ever knowing fire was real. Sarah measured her doses in whispers, never too much, never too little. A man who dies suddenly draws questions. A man who drifts into sleep never wakes at all. Elizabeth learned to vanish in plain sight, to be the playful child who served the wine and never seemed to listen. But she listened to everything. She knew which boots creaked on the floor, which voices carried guilt, which men would never be missed by morning. Together they turned murder into ritual, each role chosen, each movement rehearsed. No wasted effort, no suspicion left behind. The inn itself began to change. Its walls absorbed secrets like dry wood, drinks oil. Its halls grew quiet in ways no building should. Travellers spoke of the strange stillness after midnight, of the fire that never seemed to dim, of the sisters who smiled too warmly and never asked for payment up front, and always another man disappeared, and another, and another. Soon the sisters were no longer killing to survive. They were killing because they could, because power tastes sweet when no one dares take it from you, because every grave behind the inn proved they were untouchable. This is how evil hides, not in chaos, not in madness, but in order, in routine, in the comfort of knowing exactly who will live and exactly who will die. And still, no one suspected a thing the sisters' laws. Good at supper. They lit candles for weary travellers. They sang soft songs while men drifted into poisoned sleep. The night carried their voices like a lullaby over the valley, and the mountains kept their secret. For now, power is never satisfied with silence. It hungers for an audience. The sisters learned that fear travels faster than any rider. When a man vanished on the road to Millbrook, people whispered. When 3 vanished, they prayed. When 10 vanished, they stopped asking questions altogether. Merchants no longer passed through alone. They arrived in pairs, but even 2 men can vanish if they drink enough wine. Soon the local towns began to change. Innkeepers watched the door when the sisters entered. Sheriffs tipped their hats but never met their eyes. No one accused them. No one dared. Catherine could buy supplies on credit without a word. Margaret could request silence, and it would be given. Sarah could walk through markets gathering herbs too bitter for medicine, and no one challenged her. Elizabeth could sit on a porch and hear every secret worth hearing, because people talked when they thought no one cared. The killing slowed, but they never stopped. Not because of mercy, but because Margaret understood a truth sharper than any knife. Too much blood draws attention. Too little and people grow bold again, so they learned to pace themselves. 1 traveller every few months. Only those who would never be missed. Only those whose disappearance could be blamed on snow or wolves or whiskey. And the legend of Millbrook began to grow. People said the mountains swallowed men whole. They said the road itself was cursed. They never spoke the word murder out loud. Not in daylight, but at night, around cold hearths and empty tables. Someone always whispered the same question: what do those sisters want? The answer was never gold. Gold spends too fast. Gold leaves a trail. What they wanted was obedience, to see strong men look away when they passed, to know they could shape the valley with a glance and no one would stop them. This is how power works. It does not shout. It whispers. It offers you comfort and waits to see if you. I'll take it, and every time you do, you are already lost. The mountains kept their secret, the townsfolk kept theirs, and the graves behind the inn waited for winter to cover them again. Every perfect system eventually draws a curious eye, and curiosity is more dangerous than any blade. It was a deputy from the next county, young, sharp, carried himself like a man who believed rules were stronger than fear. He came to the inn asking questions with too many edges, names of travellers who never reached their destinations, dates that matched too neatly with stormy nights and shuttered windows. Margaret smiled and offered him stew. Catherine poured his drink and let her gaze linger. Elizabeth played at the hearth, humming low as though she did not hear. Sarah said nothing at all, which was louder than any words. The deputy stayed the night. He should not have, but men who think they are clever rarely believe danger wears a smile. Margaret did not poison him. No, killing him too soon would prove every suspicion. Instead, they fed him truth wrapped in lies. They spoke of wolves on the ridge, of thieves on the back roads, of travellers who bragged about gold and vanished into their own vices. By dawn, the deputy believed he had outsmarted them. He believed their charm was innocence, not cunning. When he left, they followed at a distance, not with footsteps, but with whispers in the right ears. By the time he reached his county line, people already doubted him. They said he drank too much. They said he chased ghosts. They said he wanted attention. The sisters never had to lift a hand. The valley itself turned against him, because when power wears a pleasant face, people protect it without even knowing why. Weeks later, the deputy was found dead on the riverbank. Not poisoned, not stabbed, simply gone cold in the water. An accident, they called it. And no one spoke his name again. This is how true evil survives. Not by brute force, but by turning the world itself into an accomplice, by making others doubt the truth until lies feel safer than questions. The sisters learned that night they could not be touched. And once a predator learns that, the hunt becomes sport. The mountains grew quieter, the graves grew deeper, and the road to Millbrook grew darker than ever before. The inn was no longer just a place to sleep. It was a throne room without walls. Travellers still came and went, but now the sisters rarely needed to lift a finger. Fear did the work for them. Margaret began visiting town councils under the guise of trade. She offered help during harsh winters. She loaned coin to struggling farms without asking for repayment, at least not in gold. Catherine hosted gatherings at the inn. Music, laughter, games. Men left those nights dizzy with charm and unaware their loyalty had been purchased without a single coin changing hands. Sarah sold her remedies in the markets, cough syrups, tinctures, powders for restless sleep. The townsfolk trusted her completely. They never wondered why the line between medicine and poison is so thin. Elizabeth wandered freely through the streets, small, innocent, listening, carrying secrets home in her pockets, like stolen candy. The sisters did not demand obedience. They made people offer it willingly, a quiet word here, a favor there, a warning that certain roads were unsafe after dark. Soon the innkeepers on nearby roads stopped competing for travelers. They sent guests toward Millbrook with eager smiles. Merchants stored their goods at the inn, as if it were the safest vault in the county. Even the sheriff's office turned its gaze elsewhere whenever questions grew uncomfortable. The valley belonged to them now, not by title, not by law, but by fear. And fear is a better leash than any chain. Every winter another man vanished, sometimes two, never enough to draw suspicion. Just enough to remind everyone who truly ruled these mountains. The sisters no longer killed for coin. They killed to remind the world that kindness has teeth. They killed to hear the silence afterward, that deep quiet when no one dares breathe the wrong word. The inn itself seemed to watch the road at night, its windows glowing like patient eyes, waiting for the next trav. Learn to step inside and mistake hospitality for safety. This is how power spreads, not in grand gestures but in soft voices and steady hands, until every door opens before you and every head bows low without knowing why. The sisters smiled, the valley obeyed, and winter buried the evidence, one snowfall at a time. Power makes people bold, and boldness makes people careless. For years the sisters had chosen their victims with precision, men who travelled alone, men who would not be missed, men whose names barely lingered in memory once they were gone. But greed is patient. It waits. It whispers that one more would not hurt, that one more would not be noticed. The mistake came with a man named Everett Cole, not a wanderer, not a stranger, but a wealthy trader known in every town along the valley. He rode with a fine horse, wore silver buckles that gleamed even in the fog, and carried rumours of gold hidden somewhere in his saddlebags. Catherine lured him easily, too easily. Men like him always believed beauty was harmless. Everett spent the evening laughing by the fire, oblivious to the quiet glances passing between sisters, oblivious to Sarah measuring her powders by the flicker of the candlelight. But Everett had friends, and friends asked questions. When he failed to reach his next stop, a search began, not by a single deputy, not by a man to be discredited, but by merchants and riders and families who would not be silenced. For the first time, strangers rode to Millbrook not seeking rest, but seeking answers. Margaret greeted them with her calmest smile. The inn was swept clean, no trace of blood, no disturbed earth behind the house. The graves lay hidden under deep snow, as if winter itself conspired to protect them. Yet suspicion is not so easily buried. The men looked too long at the sisters. Their laughter rang too hollow, their hospitality too perfect. Whispers spread through the valley, not just of wolves and storms, but of something colder, something human. The sisters had always believed they were untouchable. That belief began to crack the night Everett Cole disappeared. And once a crack appears, it only widens. This is how empires fall, not with thunder, but with the quiet sound of someone finally daring to know. Kasik on the wrong door. The sisters felt it too. For the first time they looked over their shoulders. For the first time the wind outside the inn did not feel like an ally. And winter was not finished yet. Snow packed the roads tight that winter, the kind of snow that muffles sound, the kind that swallows hoofbeats whole. Everett Cole's disappearance did not fade. It grew. Riders from 3 counties came searching. They carried lanterns that burned like angry stars. They carried questions sharper than any blade. The sisters welcomed them as honored guests. Margaret cooked hearty stews. Catherine poured wine that never seemed to empty. Sarah offered warm beds scented with herbs to soothe the nerves. Elizabeth sat by the hearth, humming low like a child too young to know fear. But fear was in the room. It curled in the corners. It whispered that someone here already knew the answers. The men searched the barns, the cellars, even the woods behind the inn. They found nothing. The sisters knew how to hide what mattered, yet suspicion clung like frost to glass. It never truly melts. It only waits for night. Margaret understood the danger, not of discovery, but of losing control. If these men left with doubt in their hearts, the valley would never obey again. So she made a choice, a terrible, elegant choice. That night the wine flowed stronger, the laughter louder, lanterns burned lower. The riders told stories of wolves and ghosts, unaware they were sitting with something worse than both. One by one their eyelids grew heavy. One by one they slumped forward into the arms of sleep. Sarah's powders worked quickly in the heat of the fire. By morning the inn was silent, too silent. No footsteps, no voices, only the wind scratching at the shutters. When townsfolk came days later searching for the searchers, the sisters wept. They spoke of a sudden blizzard that forced the men to ride out early. They spoke of deep drifts that might have swallowed them whole. No bodies were ever found, because the mountains are generous to those who know where to dig. The valley learned its lesson. Questions are dangerous, and those who ask. Too many have a way of vanishing into the snow. The sisters smiled. Power restored, but cracks once opened never truly close. The valley stayed quiet, too quiet. But silence is not always peace. Sometimes it is a warning. The riders were gone. No one came searching anymore. No one dared. Yet fear had a way of creeping inside even the walls of the inn. Margaret still gave orders, her voice steady, her smile soft. But Catherine started watching her too long. Sarah started questioning every decision. And Elizabeth began to listen at doors she had once passed by without a thought. At night the wind moaned around the shutters. The house itself seemed to breathe in the darkness. Every creak of the floorboards felt like footsteps that did not belong. Margaret told herself they were safe. She told her sisters the valley had forgotten. But she locked her room now. A leader who trusts no one is not truly leading. She was guarding herself from her own blood. Catherine whispered to Sarah in the kitchen. Sarah whispered to Elizabeth in the garden. Elizabeth whispered to no one at all. She only smiled, And smiles can be the sharpest secrets of all. The murders had stopped, but not by choice. Margaret forbade it. No more risk, no more questions. Yet hunger is harder to silence than fear. The sisters missed the thrill of it, the fire in their veins when strangers vanished into the snow. They began to resent the rules. They began to resent Margaret. Even the inn seemed to sense it, its walls colder, its shadows longer, the fire never quite warming the room no matter how high it burned. When people came now, they left quickly. Something in the air felt wrong, not the easy charm of before, but a stillness like a forest before lightning strikes. One night, Elizabeth asked a question no one had ever dared. What happens when there are no strangers left to feed on? What happens when hunger turns inward? No one answered, but they all heard the truth in the silence. Cracks in the foundation of a house do not stay hidden long, and once a family begins to fear each other, the real danger has already arrived. Storm clouds pressed low against the mountains that night. The wind howled down the pass like something alive. The inn glowed warm against the snow, but its light was a lie. Inside, the sisters moved like ghosts of themselves. Margaret pacing by the fire, Catherine sharpening a knife, not for use but for comfort. Sarah stirring the same pot over and over though no one was hungry. Elizabeth sitting by the window staring into the black woods. They had not spoken in hours, only glanced at one another with sharp eyes and tighter smiles. Then the knock came. 3 slow raps against the door. A traveller caught in the storm. A man with a heavy coat and boots caked in ice. He asked only for shelter until morning. Margaret welcomed him as she always did. But Catherine's gaze lingered too long on the stranger's pack. Sarah noticed and said nothing. Elizabeth noticed everything. While the man warmed his hands by the hearth, the sisters whispered in corners, plans tangled with suspicion. Who would handle it? Who would take the risk? Who could be trusted to share without keeping too much for herself? Old loyalties cracked open. Catherine accused Margaret of growing soft. Sarah accused Catherine of growing reckless. Elizabeth only smiled and asked who they planned to kill first, the stranger or each other. Their voices rose above the wind outside. The traveller never heard, but the house did. The old beams groaned as if they understood. Margaret ended it with a shout. Enough. No blood tonight. The storm will pass, and so will he. But storms do not pass when called, and hunger does not sleep when ordered. That night, no one rested. Margaret sat awake, clutching the poker from the hearth. Catherine kept her knife under her pillow. Sarah hid a vial of poison in her sleeve. Elizabeth hummed softly in the dark. Downstairs, the traveller slept by the fire, unaware that 4 pairs of eyes opened and closed above him, unaware that every dream in this house ended the same way. The wind screamed around the inn until morning, but it was not as loud as the silence between sisters. Dawn came grey and bitter, the kind of light that does not warm anything it touches. The storm had passed, but the house was still heavy with something darker than snow. The traveller woke to find Margaret already by the fire. Her smile was kind, but her eyes were restless. Catherine entered from the kitchen, her knife still wet from the morning frost. Sarah carried a tray of bread and tea. Elizabeth lingered on the stairs, humming a tune with no words. He thanked them for their kindness. He never saw Catherine glance at Sarah. He never saw Sarah glance at Margaret. But Elizabeth saw everything and said nothing. Over breakfast the air grew sharp. A single careless word from Catherine, a single quiet warning from Margaret, and suddenly the room was alive with anger. "You want to kill him?" Catherine hissed. "You want to kill us all," Sarah spat back. Margaret slammed her fist on the table. Elizabeth laughed like she had been waiting for this moment all her life. The traveller rose slowly from his chair. Something was wrong. Something inhuman in their voices. Something cold in the way they moved. He muttered about leaving early before the next storm. Margaret blocked his path with a smile that did not reach her eyes. "Sit," she said, "just sit." But Catherine lunged first, not at the traveller, but at Margaret. Steel flashed in the pale morning light. Sarah screamed and threw the tray. Elizabeth watched like a child at a puppet show. The traveller ran for the door, but the latch was stiff with ice. Behind him the sisters crashed against the table, shouting, cursing, the sound of wood splintering under boots. Then silence, a sudden, terrible silence. He turned just in time to see Margaret holding the knife. Catherine slumped against the wall, her breath shallow, her eyes wide, Sarah frozen in place. Elizabeth still smiling that same small smile. The traveller did not wait for explanations. He wrenched the door open and fled into the snow, his boots sinking deep, but Millbrook Valley never let its prey run far. Inside the inn, Catherine bled into the cracks of the old floor, and three sisters stared at one another with something worse than hate. They stared with hunger. The traveller ran until his lungs burned raw. Snow stung his face like broken glass. Every tree looked the same in the pale light. Every path vanished under the storm's white breath. Behind him came no footsteps, no sound at all. But that was worse, because hunters who move in silence are the ones who never miss. Margaret bound Catherine's wound with steady hands. Sarah whispered that the man must not reach town. Elizabeth only smiled and fetched her cloak. They left the inn before the fire died. 4 shapes in the swirling snow, 1 limping, 3 strong, all hungry. The traveller stumbled down the mountain pass. He told himself he would make it. He told himself the valley would listen, but fear makes liars of us all. Branches snapped somewhere behind him. A shadow flickered between pines, too tall to be a wolf, too quick to be human. He ran harder, his boots heavy with ice, every breath louder than the wind, a signal to whatever followed. At the edge of the frozen creek, he slipped. The ice cracked and moaned beneath him. He clawed his way across, praying it would hold. It held for him, but maybe not for long. Up on the ridge, Margaret watched him crawl. Sarah whispered, "They should finish it now." Elizabeth said, "No, make it last." Catherine said nothing. Her lips pale, her eyes sharp with pain. The traveller reached the old mill road, 2 miles to town if he kept moving. But the snow fell thicker. The world narrowed to white. Somewhere behind him a voice called out, soft and sweet, "Sir, wait. You forgot your pack." It was Elizabeth's voice. It carried too clearly for such a storm, and no one in the valley would ever forget that sound. He did not turn. He only ran, knowing that once they spoke your name, you never truly left Millbrook alive. The sisters closed in from 3 sides, like wolves around a dying fire. The snow buried their tracks, but not their scent, not the feeling in the air that the hunt was almost done. The traveller stumbled into town at dusk, face white with frost, breath-ragged eyes wide with terror. The first light he saw was the lantern outside the blacksmith's door. They gathered around him in silence, farmers with rough hands, merchants with wary eyes. No one spoke until he did. "Murder," he gasped. Up at the inn, 4 women. They are not what they seem. Whispers rippled through the crowd. Some crossed themselves. Others shook their heads. Old stories were waking stories the valley had buried long ago. The sheriff pushed forward, heavy coat dusted with snow. He asked questions slow and calm. How many bodies? Where is the proof? The traveller could only shake his head. No proof, only blood, only fear. Elizabeth's laughter still rang in his ears. Margaret's cold eyes still burned in his memory. Catherine bleeding Sarah whispering words that did not sound human. The sheriff frowned and told the man to rest, told the people to go home, told them there was no danger. But danger has a way of listening when you speak its name. Up on the ridge, 3 figures watched the lanterns below. Margaret held Catherine upright. Sarah carried a shovel. Elizabeth whispered that the traveller had spoken too much already. They did not hurry. They knew the valley would not believe him. They knew fear works best when it is slow. Inside the tavern, the traveller begged them to listen. He told them what he saw, told them the sisters would come. But the more he spoke, the more they doubted. His voice cracked. His words tangled. He sounded half mad. An old man in the corner muttered that the Red Sisters were just a tale, a winter story to keep children close to home. But winter stories come from somewhere, and some roots run deeper than snow. Night fell fast. The traveller sat by the fire, shaking hands wrapped around a cup he could not drink from. Outside, the wind carried soft voices across the valley, calling his name one by one. The sisters were already here. Night smothered Millbrook like a heavy blanket. The snow had stopped, but the silence was worse than any storm. The lanterns burned low in the streets and doors stayed bolted tight. The traveller sat in the tavern corner, unable to sleep. Every shadow looked like a face. Every gust of wind sounded like a voice calling his name. Then came the knock at the door. Not frantic, not hurried, a soft, patient knock, as if the caller knew it would open eventually. The sheriff answered with a hand on his revolver. 4 women stood outside, Margaret calm as a priest at prayer, Catherine, pale but steady, Sarah, holding nothing but a small bundle, Elizabeth smiling as though she were among friends. "We came for the traveller," Margaret said. "He forgot to pay for his room." The sheriff told them to leave. His voice was steady, but his eyes were not. Behind him, the traveller shook his head over and over, whispering no. More villagers gathered in the street, faces lit by cold lantern glow. The sisters stepped forward, and something in the air turned sharp, like the moment before glass shatters. Sarah dropped the bundle. It was not clothes, but bones, small and clean, the kind no animal leaves behind. A scream rose from the crowd. The sheriff drew his gun, but Elizabeth only laughed. A sound so sweet it froze the blood in every vein. Catherine moved first, faster than any wounded woman should. Her hand struck the gun aside. Her knife flashed in the lamplight. Margaret spoke a word that was not a word. The lanterns went out one by one. Darkness swallowed Millbrook street by street. Only the sound of boots on snow, the hiss of breath, the tearing of wood and flesh. When the light returned, 3 houses burned. The sheriff lay broken against the tavern wall, and the sisters stood in the smoke untouched, Elizabeth brushing ash from her sleeve, Margaret calm as ever, Sarah humming an old lullaby, Catherine smiling through blood that was not he. "Sack. The traveller tried to run, but there is no running when the valley chooses you, no running when the Red Sisters walk in your shadow." The traveller ran through streets lit by fire. Voices screamed behind him, but none called his name to help. The people of Millbrook scattered like frightened birds. But frightened birds never fly far in the dark. He reached the church. Its door swung wide as if waiting for him. Inside, the candles still burned. He knelt before the altar, whispering prayers he had not spoken in years. The wind howled outside, then stopped. The silence pressed against the walls like a living thing. Footsteps echoed on the stone floor. 4 shadows glided down the aisle. Margaret calm as ever. Catherine bleeding but strong. Sarah with hands clasped as if in prayer. Elizabeth smiling like a child about to open a gift. "You should not have come here," Margaret said. "This is our valley. It always has been." The traveller rose trembling. He told them the people would fight. He told them someone would stop them. But no one came through that open door. Catherine closed it with one hand. Sarah snuffed the candles with a single breath. The church fell black as a cave. "You ran so far," Elizabeth whispered, "but you were always running in circles." He swung the heavy iron cross from the altar. Margaret stepped into its path and caught it like it was nothing at all. Her fingers burned, but she did not let go. Catherine moved behind him. Sarah pushed him to his knees. Elizabeth leaned close and whispered his name into his ear. Once spoken, it belonged to them. The villagers found the church door open at dawn. The altar overturned. The candles burned down to stubs, but no traveller inside. No sound except the wind carrying 4 voices, soft and sweet, calling names one by one. From that night on, Millbrook kept its doors locked, its roads empty after sunset, and the inn on the mountain pass never stood empty, because the Red Sisters always welcomed guests, and guests never left.